Welcome everybody here in the medieval tower of the Kaffeeturm or in the cyberspace of our live stream. The Kaffeeturm was a prison for about 500 years, and now it's an open house for political debate and discussion. My name is Thomas Göttin. I'm no longer a gatekeeper. I'd rather try to be a door opener and to make it possible to have discussions here. It's an honor to organize this event together with the ETH Zurich, and I welcome everybody from Zurich especially. And I've learned that also people living in Bern, just about 100 meters from here, are working in Zurich and never have been here in this tower. So welcome too. This event is closely relinked to the show Planet Hope at the Bundesplatz, which is in walking distance, about 2 or 3 minutes from here. So afterwards, everybody can go and see the show together with the inputs we get here from the panel. We love this tower to be busy and to be full of discussions between civil society, between politics, and between persons from the civil society and the science. I think it's crucial for democracy, and these discussions are not easy to achieve. Sometimes they are even more difficult these days, especially in some particular topics. One topic, the topic today, rethinking living, is one of the most important for our future. I am particularly attached to it because of my former function as head of communication at the Ministry for the Environment. So I've been working in this field for a very long time. And I'm truly convinced that problems like climate change or biodiversity, or even in the last and dire consequences, deforestations, can not only need discussions in any way, but that's not enough. It rather has to be co-evolution of the formulations of the problems and the answers between science, politics, and civil society. 10 years ago, already the United Nations Environment Programme stated that 4 out of the 5 most important issues regarding environment of the 21st century are in fact cross-cutting issues, so issues about links between science, politics, and civil society. So I'm really looking forward for this discussion. I will follow it online, and I might bring in questions, remarks raised in the YouTube chat channel or by Slido from the people watching it online. The evening, as you might have remarked, is in English, aber Fragen und Bemerkungen können sehr gerne auch auf Deutsch oder Französisch eingebracht werden, und wenn nötig werden wir auch übersetzen. The floor is yours. Moderator will be Chris Lübkemann. Hello. He is head of the Strategic Foresight Hub to the president of the ETH. Is that right? That's correct. It's a long title, but it's nice. And he will introduce the topic and the guests. So enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm not sure, is the mic working yet? Or did I forget to turn it on? I might have forgotten to turn it on. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I mean that really quite sincerely, with Politforum Bern, because these dialogues between science and civil society, which includes politicians can be civil too. I mean, don't forget that this is part of civil society, is increasingly critical for all of us. As our future continues to become more and more complex, these dialogues become more and more important for us to have, to try to make and understand these. I am very privileged and pleased to welcome you to jail. It's great to have you here. I had dinner last night with a good friend, and he was explaining to me how this is where one came before your head was cut off or you were burned, and thought, I'm not quite sure if I'm so excited about that, but we are going to have a wide-ranging conversation. And we believe collectively it's critical now more than ever to rethink a very wide variety of concepts about living. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live? What will our normal be? What could it be when we're looking forward? Because everything's normal, but what would that context be that we're walking into? We know a lot of the challenges. We know that the evolution of our context is profound. And we have two individuals here who are going to share a lot with that. Rethinking Living convenes and engages experts and really great global thinkers from ETH Zurich and from around the world, so we can take time from all of our busy lives to think about these. Very often some of these issues are so large it might be easier just to pull your head inside of the shell and ignore them. We're very fortunate here in Switzerland to be able to have such a beautiful life, but these challenges are profound. And the title of our evening is Planet Hope. Because without hope, what have we? It's a reference to that spectacular light show, which is taking place right now, and we're going to, most of us, I hope, will walk over and see it, and it's supported by ETH for the first time this year. And it covers climate change, and other colleagues on it, and the transformation of our landscape, of our world. And these are topics which we are going to explore this evening. And it's a pleasure to have with me two esteemed colleagues from the ETH in Zurich. Adrienne Grêt-Regamey is an environmental scientist and landscape planner, professor at the chair of planning landscape and urban systems. I've got to make sure I read it exactly right. I'll make sure I get
Good
this.
job.
At the Institute for Spatial and Landscape Development. And I really like, because she compares landscape planning to being like a doctor advising a patient, suggesting positive interventions to ensure a healthier future. Not just for the landscape, but also for the communities, which are part of that landscape. And as she says, like doctors, she and other landscape planners have to think holistically. We can no longer just look at the single system. And to remind each one of us here today and online are also part of that landscape. It's our opportunity and our obligation to remember that. We're not separate. Next to her is David Bresch, a well-known expert on assessing weather and climate risks. Really, for many, many years, just trying to figure out how do we understand how these changes could impact us and how they are. He's professor for weather and climate risks at our Department of Environmental System Science. His research focuses on the impacts of weather and climate on socio-economic systems. And he contributes his expertise to sound environmental decisions in business and politics, both here at home and abroad. And for him, that switch to climate neutral energy, switch to climate neutral life gives us lots of opportunity. And for him, hope. So, did I represent both of you correctly?
Absolutely.
Pretty much? Okay, I'm just checking. So, our program this evening is going to be quite simple. We're going to have a bit of a chat first, and then we really want you to be engaged. This is what the Käfig-Turm is really about, is that dialogue. So you'll have an opportunity after about 5-10 minutes to put your hand up or whatever you want to do. You can throw a scarf or text someone, I don't know. But then we'll bring a microphone to you and you can ask the question auf Deutsch, à la français, or in English, and then we'll do our very best to answer it. And then also online, you're very, very welcome, please, to pop questions to us because we will integrate those as best we can. And then, after our conversation, we will retire to the Bundeshausplatz, to see the Planet Hope. Are we ready? We'll try it again. Are we ready? Yes. All right, that's much, much better. Thank you. Here we go. Okay. So, Adrienne and David, the title for this evening is Planet Hope. When we look at the last IPCC report, which essentially tells us that our grandchildren of the next 2-3 generations we're going living in a Switzerland more or less without glaciers, what gives you hope? Adrienne?
Good question. I think there's an important part when you ask me about hope. I think it's hope is something which is unreachable, and I think it might be better to think about turning maybe threats to opportunities, which is something I could better imagine than just a hope, because if I'm talking about a hope, I would never reach that hope. Sure. And so I think there's many changes which also provide opportunities. And one example is thinking about changing in. We have an increase in population. Is that a threat? Of course, it is a threat. But we can think also about a new way this population can use the planet, and maybe also a new kind of way we can participate in the engagement with these people on this planet to maybe remove the hope or to reduce the threats we have with this population, which is migration and inequalities, etc. So I think starting by thinking about these threats and trying to turn them into hope, or what I said, opportunities, might be a way to go, maybe for tonight.
So if you think very specifically, you are an individual who I know loves mountains, and you spend a lot of time with mountains and mountain communities as well as part of your work. And when you talk with the communities, or you're doing some work with mountain communities, turning this threat into opportunity. So can you share a little bit about that?
Exactly. So I think the first thing to understand is that the mountains provide a lot of services. The capital, the natural capital, provides tourism services, it provides carbon sequestration, it provides fresh water. It has many services, so-called ecosystem services, how we call them. And I think while the climate is changing, of course, the first reaction would be we're losing all these services. But the temperature will also allow us to also provide new services, which we have to manage now. We have to think what is going to happen in 20 years in the mountains. There's new lakes appearing. There's new services because it's possible to do agriculture at higher altitude. And there's many new claims at the moment in these areas. And it's very important that we think about what's going to happen in 20 years in the mountains, and that we start to manage for these resources, because there's many interests and we need to understand how we want to do that. So what we can learn now, I think, is to understand how we were not able to manage such resources as a common pool resource, as a resource which is given to everybody, and to try to think about how these new resources need to manage it. And this could be a big opportunity, even for Switzerland.
That's interesting, really. So as we're looking at the glaciers retreating, all of a sudden, instead of thinking that, well, we've lost the glaciers, we're saying we've gained all this land, right? This is...
we need to adapt.
Right.
There's no way that we can very quickly short this. It's a slow process. And we have to understand how we can harness these new services in such a way that they sustainably will be provided.
Yeah.
We have certain services we are dependent on, which is fresh water, for example, which is going to disappear, but there's another way also to get the fresh water. But we're not ready.
Yeah.
We are fighting each other against certain uses of this landscape already at the moment, while it's happening, and we need to adapt and to think how to better manage these resources.
So it's managing the resources, but also managing the risks in one way, which gives me the way to go over to David. This R-I-S-K, four-letter word. It's a good four-letter word. I'm going to ask the same question to you. What gives you hope?
Bit in the same vein, but trying to ground the concept of hope in the sense of do we manage to transition into a more sustainable lifestyles in the ways we can cope with the boundaries of the planet in a very constructive fashion. And there's basically two elements that come to my mind. One is really the role of fashion, because very funny enough in my neighborhood, heat pumps become fashion. So people don't wait for a ban on things, but it looks like it becomes a status item almost to have a net zero building. Now you would say you should have due to insight and deep reasoning. No, it's because the neighbor does it. And that's interesting. So it's an element to play with, to say we're all human beings and probably look around. And this navigating an uncertain time has also the potential for us to change. So I see that as a piece we might be able to build on. And the other one is a very technological one, which is really grid parity of solar photovoltaics. Because for a long time, you really had to say, look, let's be honest, it's not so easy to harvest this endless stream of energy on the planet. And so you have to go to all kind of other means of producing energy in order to consume it and all of that. And I see there a tremendous shift in how we look at the problem. Again, if we step back a bit and say, could we not re-engineer some of the systems so we can basically harness more of the abundance of energy that's out there? The question is more what you do with it. And I sometimes think, and that's probably where then fashion also has the negative twist to it, right? That we consume more and more. And so I hope also that that moment in time where we do really overuse this planet does kind of help us to understand where limits are, and also I might say that it's also an element of beauty of limits, because it brings you back to yourself and you ask what's really important to us. And I could see also there a bit of hope, even for an abundance society, or kind of a society like us, which overutilizes a lot of things, to ask, do we really need that? And often a good chat with a close friend with a glass of wine is all you need. And so to some extent, we might sometimes use this also a bit to tell ourselves what's really relevant in life.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you something. So, because a lot of your research in your professional life has been dealing with, I'll say, algorithms, trying to actually put rational assessment to what very many would say is a hugely emotive issue, which is the fear of the unknown. Right? This is part with risk assessment and trying to quantify risk. You're trying to say, well, should we truly be afraid of this, and to what degree? And what's interesting?
Yeah.
Yes. No.
I think the reason I turned to risk first was for me to understand the complex system and the impacts of a change in a complex system. The climate system, often it's all ocean, land, and atmosphere, and these processes and how they play together, how they impact society, be it in terms of their infrastructure, but also people and their livelihoods and so on. And one concept to frame that is risk. But I think it's often not the best concept to motivate action, because it can also basically lead to the reaction to just say, this is too big, I don't look at it, or this is just a result of some kind of algorithm, it hasn't yet manifested itself. And so often it's more, once you turn it into options you might take or not take, it gets interesting. They'd say, aha, there are lifestyles I can engage with which reduce my interference with the system. And that was also the idea, to bring it back from the impact side of things. We look at how does weather and climate impact you, how we impact the system. To what extent can we avoid the system to turn into a range where it's hard not only to predict what's happening, but also to deal with. So it was also a bit this element of saying, putting a price tag on these impacts, and price tag does not always need to mean dollars, just to understand what might these outcomes look like, might also be a reason for people to say, hey, do we need to go that far to really experience it the hard way?
Yeah. So when we think about, to me, the two of you represent a very interesting spectrum when we're looking at climate, right? And very much from trying to assess the impacts to, on the ground, what can we be doing? Right, and this is what I'm very interested in. And so when I think of the two of you, I see these two parts playing. When you think of civil society, how do the two of you think about engaging sort of civil society in these topics, and to help them go have hope, or see opportunities, or move to action? How do you do it?
So I think the topic hope is really comes back here in the method, how we do it. We really start usually by thinking about what is the vision? What are the future opportunities? So we first try, for example, we work in the Valais, just an example, and we ask, for example, the Lonza is coming, and there's many new inhabitants coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. And the question is, how can we develop this valley in the future under climate change? It's very warm in the summer in the valley, and what is going to be in 20 years the living and the quality in the valley? And so the first thing what we do is we try to discuss and to co-create. we heard about discussing co-dialogue, we try to understand what are these visions, what would be such a future. And then based on this future, we try to understand how can we reach that future. So we look at the pathways, and the pathways will depend on different constraints. They will depend on spatial planning rules. They will based on climate change, which we will maybe not be able to change drastically in the next 20 years. So we have different pathways, and we try to understand which of these pathways will help us to reach this future. So it's often also called in the energy sector backcasting. And we're trying to understand at which point in time we need to intervene in the system to be able to reach such a future. So, for example, in the Valais, we've done this exercise, and a future they envisaged was really to have new neighborhoods which are in the mountains, to be able to very quickly reach Saas-Fee in 10 minutes or 15 minutes max, at a very short timeline with not the road, but with some kind of a gondola, exactly. And so that very quickly they could reach these areas to have a good life quality and work in the valley where the industrial area is. And the question is, what do you need to do to reach that? And one of the important elements really not to block possible pathways is spatial development, is to really drive where people are building at the moment. Where are they putting their houses? And I think this is extremely important considering all the risk we have, risk related also to the water, to the glaciers, to the change in the flooding, etc. in the valley. Where do people live? Yeah. That's one of the main constraints one needs to understand.
Interesting. So the rules that we have control over, some of these things we don't have control over, but the rules we do.
Exactly.
How do we get them to change, to be prepared? David, what about you?
Methodologically, we are very close. So we also employ a lot of scenario thinking to first understand, say, the risk landscape today. That entails a lot of modeling, extreme events hitting stuff, people and infrastructure and so on. But then to basically figure what's changing in that landscape, in all the more than something like 30 case studies we've done by now all over the globe, it was always a very deep engagement with stakeholders to figure where do they want to go. It's the same story. It's basically risk is the effect of uncertainty on a goal you want to reach. So if you have no clue about your goal, you don't have a risk. Well, you have a risk of missing opportunities, but it's basically if in many of these studies people felt, there is extreme events and climate change, and that's all risky. But then we figured the biggest challenge for them was to figure where they want to be. To really figure what does spatial planning, but also economic development, just development in general mean and what that might entail, because it might expose you to more things that happen. So if you build on the coast and there's no change at all in hurricanes, but just more people there, obviously there are more people at risk. And often in most of these studies we figured the change we bring to the system ourselves locally is the bigger driver of risk than the change that comes through climate change. And that holds until about 2040. And then it gets really difficult. And that's why it's again an argument for the 1.5 degree kind of target, so well below 2 degrees according to Paris, to say if we stay within that operating space, then the way we shape our future is also the way we consciously can shape our risk landscape. But if you exceed that kind of threshold, it gets very hard, because then the frequency and intensity of the extremes starts to hit you so often that no matter what measures you take to try to kind of remedy the situation, it hits you again. So in that sense, there's an element there of really figuring what future states might look like, and are they ones we crave for, and how could we reach them?
Sure.
And then figure how we get there.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Do you want to comment on that? Or
No.
Okay. So here's a chance to turn to you. Just remind you, you are welcome to ask questions about anything that we have asked so far. If you feel I haven't asked the right question, then you're up. Please go ahead and ask it. So this is chance number one. I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to start asking. I know a few people here in the audience. I'm going to ask you specifically. You're see, a few names I know.
Thank
you see, so yeah.
So you mentioned, Adrienne, the ecosystem services in the beginning. I was just wondering how important do you think it is that we as a society, or as a society in general, is to agree on a price tag on ecosystem services? Because I mean, we all agree that's hugely important, but in the modeling and the risk taking and understanding risks, how important is it to put the price tag and agree as a society, not as experts, which can probably do it. Can you elaborate a bit on the because I think it's hugely important, the term ecosystem services.
Great. Okay.
So
great. Thanks.
I would say the issue with valuing ecosystem services is that they will get an infinitive price. And the goal is here not to say it's so high that it's more, I mean, if you look at the people who have done that, like Costanza or something, you get trillions of the GDP which we have. And as such, for decision making, that from my point of view, that doesn't make sense. That's not useful. What would be useful is to say that we want some ecosystem services. Let's say we want to cool our cities as a normative endpoint. The question is more, if this is a service we want, how does the ecosystem has to function? And there I come back to the insurance understanding. We need to understand the ecosystem is our insurance. It's where we can invest in terms of having this flow of services produced. But exactly the amount is going to be very different where you are and very different on the demand. If there's more people, you will have more, you will need more of these services, and the price would then kind of change. But it doesn't matter if it's $5 or if it's $10, because $5 here is a total added value. Even if you put that price tag here, if you look in Africa, this $5 is something very, very different. So for me, it's much more important to understand it as a normative endpoint, but to work on the functioning of the system to be able to get this continuous flow of the service. So try to think about the capital. And we had a very nice project in Singapore where we were asked to quantify the natural capital of Singapore. And there it was very interesting to understand just how many degrees. It was not about the price of the degrees, because it depends on what kind of cooling machine you're going to use to quantify that. But how many degrees and how much mangroves do we need to have an impact on the waves which are coming in? And just that you know, in Switzerland at the moment there is a big effort on trying to use ecosystem services for quantifying biodiversity in the frame of ecological infrastructure. So we're trying in Switzerland at the moment to use ecosystem services as a unit to say, hey, you need to secure biodiversity. And you could secure it by just having a good recreational area where you can have tourism. But this can be a side effect for more biodiversity depending on how you do the tourism. And so here I think it's really a normative endpoint which can help us. And I would, if possible, not go too much in the money part.
David?
Yeah, sure not. And to echo that, I mean, impact research is not about dollars. It's about impacts. And you have to engage in a deep conversation with your stakeholders what the metric is you measure impact. Is it the number of potentially affected people? You don't need a dollar value for that. And more theoretically kind of thinking is that a good you can trade, it's absolutely fair to put a price tag on it. So you can, to really make it blunt as an example, you can put a price tag on a slave and trade it. But this is deeply immoral because this is a human being. And this has a dignity and not a value. And so in that sense, it goes back to Kant. So it's basically, there are things, for example, the beauty of nature. If you put a price tag to it, you basically don't adjust it to the beauty of it. And I know it always looks like hand waving, but it isn't. And I think we have to constantly refer to that and to remind people that we are part of a bigger kind of system. And if we try to solve it all, allocating through dollars, we're going to really rather mess it up than solve it. What's all important to say, on the other hand, is to say, yes, ecosystems have a tremendous value in also helping us adapt to a changing environment. They also help us mitigate risk. In a coastal area, mangrove buffers and reefs, they moderate waves and impacts. So they have a deep value in better managing risk. But for many of these services, you don't need a price tag. You just need to understand they help you have a better life behind these buffers. And therefore, I'm quite hesitant to
let me challenge you with
monetize.
that for a second. Hold on.
And thank you for the explanation. I'm just wondering if, I mean, the way you just described this, David, is this something which you perceive by the politicians and policymakers who are hugely important in that equation as well, that they see it the same way? Because I think the tendency is that policymakers tend to ask you as experts to put the price tag on it, because then it's easier for them to tell, well, if it costs that much for society, we can change laws and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm an ecologist, but so I understand the concept, but I just fear, because we're in the Politforum, when it comes to policy making, how important is it that we as experts, or ETH as an expert organization, is providing policymakers with not the numbers, but help them to understand that this is really not about the price tag, which I fully agree, but about what you said in the beginning, which I very liked.
I think there's very different things you talk about here at the moment. There's on one hand the whole story about price and value, which I think is important to communicate. The price is not the same than value. But on the other hand, I think I'm working a lot with decision maker, and important is that they can negotiate the different things. There's not one at one place. There's not all the things which have to be produced. You want to have a certain, especially in Switzerland, which is very heterogeneous. You have the Graubünden has other services to provide than Zurich, and you want the decision maker to be able to negotiate. And of course, price can be an important unit to be able to negotiate, but you will not then negotiate the service itself, but you will negotiate the how that capital, nature capital, will trigger some inputs into tourism or hotels or natural hazard or protection. So let's say you have a good forest, it might be good for recreation, for tourism, but it might also protect you from avalanches, and you don't have to put money into there. So it's more about allowing to understand what it triggers. And as such, it's an indirect price, I would say, and you don't have to say it costs 5 francs per hectare, or I think it's this much of a value. So I think if you think about these economic accounting systems, which are being pushed more and more, I think they don't put a price value on the service itself, but they put a price on how the natural capital is key for other sectors. And I think as such it makes sense, and I think it's important to do that. Let's say you buy coffee, you want to know how much, if I would buy I don't know, better coffee or whatever, or coffee where you don't have too much deforestation, you might want to know how much it triggers other economic sectors in a good sense. And as such, I think it makes sense to have the natural capital. Maybe you need to pay less for pesticides or something like that. You don't want me to talk.
No, it's good. No, it's good. I just want to, David, go ahead, and then I want to come back to you with something, challenge you with something. So I think, because Adrienne, you started going into a direction which I thought was very important, because we have to be able to speak the language of those who need to hear something. We can't just say, sorry, I'm not going to give you that. You need to be a better person and understand value in a better way. Right? So that never works. So we have to still be able to, as you started to describe, what would it cost to build all the avalanche protection, or to put in a new water treatment system, or I don't know. I'm just trying to think of. There has to be ways we can also do this, so it's not just.
Yeah, but I mean, it's very much to the point about comparing options. And it's not about absolute prices, and it's not about absolute values even. It's relative values. And most of the case study I've been involved in, it was about adaptation. So it was not about mitigation, it was about adaptation. So say, again, stick to that example, tropical cyclone hitting a coast or an avalanche, and a valley with avalanches hitting infrastructure. And you often have a budget, and you'd like to figure what's the most effective way to use this money. It's not efficient, effective. Say over a very long time, you really invest in the best thing to do. And then you compare what's the benefit of reforestation, afforestation, to really keep your protective forest in good shape. And you can that's a value, because this forest, this labor in a forest and so on has a service you have to buy, has a price tag. That's absolutely fine. And this forest has a protective effect, and you can compare this protective effect compared to the protective effect of putting more and more artificial avalanche defenses in the area, and that you can compare. The risk mitigation effect of forest versus these engineering solutions, both are engineering, but kind of nature-based and not so much nature-based solutions. And that's something you can then really discuss and value and weight against each other.
Fair. Okay. Other questions? Different tact. Gonna come over here. Yep. Come over here. Yes.
Danke, ich werde auf Deutsch. Ja.
Ja,
also Greta Thunberg hat ja uns aufgerufen, eine andere Welt für die Jugend eigentlich für in Zukunft zu verlassen. Also was machen wir als Erwachsene mit unserer Konsumgesellschaft, die Multis eigentlich, die was sie alles anbieten, nicht nur uns, aber auch der dritten Welt, oder? Und die Frage ist nicht, was für eine Welt wir offen, sondern was für eine Welt wir verlassen. Was machen wir für die Jugend für in Zukunft. Das heißt, wir sollten uns 20-30% von unserem Lebensstandard zurückziehen und vielleicht in unentwickelte Länder investieren, damit sie auch etwas davon haben und nicht in unsere Länder auswandern, oder? Weil sie ja keine Reserve mehr haben, weil ich nütze ihnen alle Reserven aus. Also eigentlich ist noch wichtig, dass man nicht nur 600 Kilo im Jahr pro Kopf Abfall produziert, sondern vielleicht wird vor 30, 40 Jahren auf 200, 300 Kilo reduzieren, indem dass man auf viele Sachen verzichtet. Ich denke, das war eine offene Frage.
So, eine Frage, a question for you. What do you think?
Yeah, question. In a sense, you're absolutely right. I mean, one wants to basically live in a world which has a future, and you would like to shape it such as a better future, a longer future. And then the question is, what's the biggest lever you have? And obviously, for the single individual, one lever is to at least reflect on consumption patterns. That's how I would often say it without telling people what to do, because I'm shying a bit away from better knowing than others. So that's a bit of the piece to say, just reflect on whether you really need that. And is that really something that makes you really so much happier, that you crave for it so much that it doesn't matter who else is suffering, you still need it. And if you have these kind of conversations with yourself, you start to figure, there's a couple things I really don't even have to touch. Then the other thing is you're not a single individual, you're normally living in a society, and copy-paste from neighbors. I mentioned at the beginning a very positive example, but there are also the other ones, and it's not so easy to stay away from that and say, no, I don't do this and that. And again, I'm shying away from mentioning things, because flying is not bad per se, for example, and eating meat neither. Yeah, but the point is the amount of. and so on. And that's the consumption piece to it. And the next thing is how we transform a society in a direction that becomes more circular, and more of the stuff we produce can be reused, and so on. And then basically it's a bit the example also with the harvesting solar power. That's not something you have. If you manage that, you don't have to be super kind of how to say constrained in what you do, because this energy source is abundant. It's then again the question what makes sense to do with it, but it's more how we change into a way we use our resources such that they replenish themselves. And this is a non-trivial thing, but you see some firms doing that. And just one example to make it specific, one I really love is the Mosa tiles. They do plattly. So, and instead of that, you buy the stuff, you rent them, and once you don't like your bathroom anymore, then you take them away, you grind them. And the fact is, if you do that properly, you can even use that process to clean the water that gets into it, because this thing absorbs a lot of stuff in the water. And it's just fascinating to see a completely different way to look at a tile manufacturing company, which becomes all of a sudden a cleaning company. And these elements, I think, is something we should more and more look into.
That's a very good point, just about reconsidering all aspects of our life, because the question you're asking is, what are we doing to leave the world in a better condition for the next generations? The next generation is going to have at least, I'm putting words down into your mouth, at least the same kind of living standard that we have enjoyed in our lives. I think this is an interesting thing. So in many ways, as you're saying, reconsidering each component of the Gesellschaft. So does it need to be, how do you make it circular? How do you recreate that process? So, I always think the example, and I'm going to come to you, Adrienne, is like before 2 generations ago, they were some unintentional vegetarians in many cases, because you had a Sunday roast. You ate meat 1 time a week for most, except the noble families, unless you lived on a farm, because that's all you could really afford. And so it's very interesting to think, if we look back, the lessons we can learn over time, of intentional and unintentional life standards. So for you, the question, what are we doing to leave our world a better place, or at least as good for the next generations?
I have some, I'm a little bit worried. I have to say, I can't say that we're going to do that as good as we're thinking, and I totally understand what you say, but I think it's very, it's not that easy. I'll tell you one example. We have voted for our energy strategy 2050. And to do so, we would need 800 windmills. We have 15 in Switzerland, and we need, until 2050, 800 of them. So the Confederation has prepared a plan where these energy infrastructure could be. And we tried to, so we asked people, we put them in simulation environment, and we said, so how is it when you hear the wind power behind your house? And they saw it. And when we asked them without seeing it, they said, yes, very important energy strategy, we're going to change everything. And as soon as they saw that, and it's true, the energy with the windmill is going to be there, because that's where there's wind. There's not wind everywhere in Switzerland. There's just certain places where there's wind. They will not accept it. So I think this shows the emotion, the affective part of these decisions is something we need to better take into account. And I think that's not my research, but whatever movements exist and political engagement and discussion, I think is extremely important. And I think I have hope. I have 2 kids which they are different than we were. But it's a question, are they going to stay that way, and are they going to do that step? But I don't know. But I have to say I'm as worried as you are when talking about that, because it's true, our footprint on the other countries is even bigger than what we can do here, and even what we voted here as a normative step, we are not able to implement that. So I think there's a long way to go here.
That's really, really, really good point on that one, especially. Other questions? There are a couple of individuals who are under my age here. I'd like I would like very much for you to ask a question. I'm looking at you up front here, and you don't want to ask a question, but I would like for you to, please. And someone in the back, go ahead. You can think of one for a minute, then we're going to come to you, okay? In the back, yeah.
You first. First.
Okay.
I take the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you rethink living in the future? I'm glad that you mentioned about the population of the world. If you hear all the protests of the activists, environmental activists, you never heard about it. Not even Greta would hear about that. The impact of population, especially in the north, in the developed countries, for the consumers' mentality, I think that we have to rethink. Children, everybody can produce children, of course, that's their right, but we don't have to produce 4 or 10 or 12 children. And I'm not so pessimistic about the future, because now, especially now, if you really follow up, there's a lot of innovative ideas, innovative inventions, especially ETHs and the other universities. We should only try to be open to these new ideas, whether it's in agriculture, in ocean, with our energy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of startup, etc. But then the people should be open to these new ideas. Like, let's take, for example, the agriculture.
Okay.
No, we can.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. I think the question, you've got two things, is population, and then you are, it's wonderful to hear, are hopeful. This is Planet Hope, and you believe in the next generations, the power of the next generations. I want to come back to both of you, because you both are faculty at ETH. The students, when you are working with your students, do you find them to be hopeful? Do you find them to be, depressed about the future? Do you find them to be like, we're going to solve it, we're going to kick it? I mean, where do you see this?
No, we have the best job in the world. We have all. No, it's true. I mean, the young people studying at ETH, I mean, I have the environmental engineers, and they are positive about, they want to do something, and they are really, as you said, there's many technological advances, there's many seeds which can be planted for changing the pathways, and I think there's a lot of hope in this generation.
That's great. That's good to hear. I'm glad. David, what about you?
Yeah, I would agree in general as a kind of the general feeling is positive, but then there are really moments of insight that the problem is truly really big, and it's not the single individual who makes the big change, but it does contribute either way. And there I had do have occasional conversations where people are really desperate. That is part of it, especially when after the CO2 law not passing, some felt, how can that happen in a society being so affluent like us and so on? And then it does take time to jointly and together understand, why did this not work, and what were elements, and how do you have to work on? And from that on you take also again energy out of these conversations, as the students do too, to say, we have to better explain elements, so to better understand why people are not able, willing, or whatever to move, because often they're all in good faith. It's not that it's just some didn't see how that could come all about, and so then it's another element for students to say, we have to deeply engage and truly understand, and that's something which again brings rather a positive twist to it than despair. So we don't see it on our campus desperation. And you wouldn't expect from a technical university the only thing to say, it's not technology which will save us. It's the use of technology and basically the co-creation of these solutions. And that's why it's also important that we venture out of that and figure what really works on the ground and with people.
Great. Thanks, David. Adrienne, do you want
I wanted to add the
Go ahead, yes.
No, I think you made the point.
Okay. Well, I think it's really quite good. I'm very fortunate tonight to have my son is with me here tonight. And one of the things I remember talking about a few years ago, and he's just finishing university, but Papa, look, you've been around a lot longer. This is my context. but we're going to solve it, right? I'm going to help solve the energy problem. We're going to solve this. It's going to be okay. He's like, okay, Papa, it's okay, you know, we got this, right? And it was very interesting to me that this sort of attitude of, okay, you can freak out, and we're going to solve it with you. And that gives me hope. And I think about what truly gives me hope, and come back to this, is that opportunity which this next generation sees in their new normal, right? And this is what, so I'm going to get back to you, because we have to wrap up very, very soon here in the next couple of minutes. So I'm really sorry, we're going to have to, right? I'm looking at my timekeepers, the minders here, and say, but I want to ask both of you. You said you didn't, yeah?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yes.
All right. We can have.
You are the moderator.
Yeah, I want to ask our guest right here. I said, everyone in the room here right now, how many of you are hopeful for our future? Just are you hopeful? Because she said she was hopeful. How many of you are hopeful, and how many of you are not so hopeful? Like, who's an optimist and who's like, oh God, really, Chris? Come on, don't ask me that question. Put your hands up high. I want the optimist to say, it's gonna get, yeah. So it's about half, but maybe 2/3. No, it's okay. I mean, seriously. I mean, yeah. And this is why we're here in this room, is to talk about these things, exactly this, as we've just done tonight. And I think these are not easy subjects of many, many subjects. We start to pull it apart. So I think we have to have more and more of these kind of dialogues where we really look honestly at 2100 and we think what the challenges are and what are our pathways. And so I think that's what you shared with us tonight, various insights into how the two of you think about this. It's been for me a delight, as always. Whenever I have the chance to speak with both of you, I always learn, which is truly, again, a privilege to be in this with you. And I want to thank both of you for making time to come here into jail, to talk to us, to be with us. And I also really want to thank all of you here who have chosen to come tonight, to be in the tower with us in the Käfigturm, and of course to Thomas Götten and the team of the Politforum for your hospitality and for really allowing us to work with you to bring this evening to this, to this really difficult topic. I mean, it's a difficult one, right? And I think it's nice to stare it in the face because we can't avoid it. Right? It is our future. So, thank you so much. And Thomas, it's over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting and lively discussion for the people on the podium, but also for the ones who participated here. I'm always delighted to see there are so many people with so many questions, remarks, inputs that we never run out of questions. So that's fine. And I hope to see you again. I think it's really important to work together to discuss things. So it was a pleasure for us to have you here, the ETH Zurich. Hope we might do it again. We continue some kinds of these discussions. Next week we talk about Palestine with the guest writer Adrienne Schibli. She's here and we are having this discussion in English. And in about 2 weeks or a month, we are talking something which is closely linked to your discussion. We talk about social innovation. And I'm really looking forward to that too. There are a lot of problems, a lot of topics to continue. So we will continue the discussion. I got something for the panel. It's landscape. It's stones.
Thank you. I love it.
And it's risk, so it's still stones.
Thank you.
And for a good moderator, it's stones to eat just to have a good sound. Thank you, everybody. And as you might know, the show is right around the corner. So when you go out, you follow this the big Bärengraben where used to be the beers in the 16th century, and then you see already when it started. And enjoy the evening. If somebody wants to have news about what we are doing, so you could subscribe to the newsletter or you have a look at the website. And good evening. Thanks.
Thank you.